In March of 2021, a little-known investment firm called Archegos Capital Management collapsed almost overnight, triggering losses of more than $10 billion at some of the largest banks on Wall Street. For years, Archegos had operated with almost none of the oversight applied to hedge funds of similar size, not because it was hiding illegally, but because of a single legal classification. It called itself a family office. This video isn't about conspiracy theories or secret societies. It's about something far more interesting and far better documented: the specific, entirely legal structures, regulatory exemptions, share classes, and corporate registration rules that let enormous fortunes operate with a level of privacy and control that would be unthinkable for an ordinary public company or an ordinary bank account. Today, we're examining exactly how that architecture works. If you want the real mechanics behind generational wealth and power, not speculation, documented law, and filings, subscribe now. This channel breaks it all down every week. 1. The family office, a hedge fund that isn't regulated like one. Let's start with the exact legal mechanism behind our cold open, because it's one of the most consequential and least understood exemptions in modern finance. Before 2010, most single-family offices, the private firms wealthy families use to manage their own money, avoided registering with the Securities and Exchange Commission by relying on something called the private advisor exemption, available to any investment advisor with fewer than 15 clients. Then the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act, passed in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, specifically to close regulatory gaps exposed by that crisis, repealed that exemption entirely. Recognizing that the Investment Advisors Act was not designed to regulate families managing their own wealth, as one law firm's analysis of the rule change put it, Congress specifically directed the SEC to carve out a new dedicated exemption just for family offices. The SEC's final rule, adopted in June 2011, defines a qualifying family office using 3 conditions. It must provide investment advice only to family clients, a defined category that includes descendants, spouses, certain trusts, and even key employees. It must be wholly owned and controlled by those family clients, and it must not hold itself out to the public as an investment advisor. Meet those 3 conditions, and a family office, regardless of its total assets under management, regardless of how much leverage it uses, and regardless of how many family members participate in it, is completely excluded from registration under the Investment Advisors Act. As the SEC's own rule release states plainly, none of those factors are disqualifying. This is where the Archegos case becomes genuinely instructive, rather than simply a headline. Archegos, founded by Bill Huang, represented itself as a qualifying single-family office and, by doing so, avoided many of the reporting and oversight requirements that would have applied to an equivalent hedge fund managing outside investors' money. According to testimony before the House Financial Services Committee by then SEC Chairman Gary Gensler, Archegos built enormous, concentrated stock positions using a specific financial instrument called total return swaps. Contracts that gave it the economic exposure of owning huge blocks of stock in specific companies without ever directly owning the shares or triggering the beneficial ownership disclosure rules that would normally apply to a position that large. When those concentrated bets went wrong, the fund's collapse caused billions in losses at the banks that had financed its trades. Banks that, in several cases, hadn't fully appreciated the scale of Archegos' total exposure, partly because the family office structure and the swap-based trading kept so much of that exposure outside normal public disclosure channels. In the aftermath, Senator Sherrod Brown, then chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, formally questioned the banks that had financed Archegos about exactly what due diligence they had performed. The episode prompted a broader, ongoing regulatory conversation about whether the family office exemption, designed to spare ordinary wealthy families from hedge fund-level bureaucracy, had inadvertently created a blind spot large enough for a firm managing tens of billions of dollars in swap exposure to operate with dramatically less transparency than a comparable registered investment advisor. It's worth being precise about what this section is and isn't arguing. The family office exemption exists for a genuinely reasonable policy reason. An ordinary family managing its own inherited wealth is not the same kind of systemic risk as a firm actively soliciting and managing money from outside investors, and subjecting every wealthy family to full hedge fund-style registration would be a significant and arguably unnecessary regulatory burden. But the Archegos episode demonstrates something worth understanding clearly. The same legal classification that protects an ordinary family's privacy can, in rare and extreme cases, also shield an enormously leveraged, market-moving position from the kind of scrutiny regulators apply to comparably sized public players, a genuine trade-off, not a hidden conspiracy, built directly into how the exemption was written. This is exactly the kind of concrete mechanism-first breakdown this channel exists for. If the Archegos story surprised you, drop a comment with the word exempt. It tells me you want more deep dives into how real financial regulation actually works. 2. One share, one vote, not if you're the founder. The second structural tool in this video operates in full public view, disclosed in SEC filings that anyone can read, and yet it still manages to concentrate enormous corporate power in remarkably few hands. The dual-class share structure. Here's the basic mechanic. A company creates two or more categories of stock. One category, typically sold to the public, carries one vote per share. A second category, typically held by founders, executives, and early investors, carries far more voting power per share, often 10 votes, sometimes 20, in at least one documented case effectively unlimited. Both classes usually carry identical economic rights, the same dividends, the same claim on profits, but the voting power is wildly disproportionate to the ownership stake. Google's 2004 IPO is widely credited with normalizing this structure in modern technology markets. In its own IPO prospectus, filed directly with the SEC, Google's founders explained the reasoning in their own words. The dual-class structure would make it harder for outside parties to take over or influence Google, while making it easier for our management team to follow the long-term, innovative approach emphasized throughout the company's public offering documents. Facebook's 2012 IPO followed a similar model, and Snap's 2017 IPO took the concept to its most extreme public form. Snap sold non-voting shares to the public entirely, meaning ordinary IPO investors received literally 0 votes on any corporate matter, while founders Evan Spiegel and Bobby Murphy retained nearly all voting control. The gap this creates between economic ownership and actual control can be genuinely striking. According to public filings and financial analysis, Mark Zuckerberg controls approximately 57% of Meta's total voting power, while owning only around 13.6% of the company's actual equity. The Ford family maintains roughly 40% of Ford Motor Company's voting power through a special class of shares, despite holding only around 4% of the company's total economic value. a structure that has persisted since Ford's 1956 IPO, making it one of the longest-running examples of this exact tool. Spotify's founders Daniel Ek and Martin Lorenzon, through a system of beneficiary certificates established at their 2018 direct listing, together control roughly 75% of total voting power. This isn't hidden information. It's disclosed prominently in every relevant company's public SEC filings. And organizations like the Council of Institutional Investors have argued publicly and forcefully against the practice for decades on the explicit principle that voting power should be proportional to the economic interests of the holders. The Council's own concern, stated directly in its governance guidance, is that concentrated, unaccountable control allows the extraction of private benefits for the controllers at a cost that is imposed disproportionately on the broader shareholder base, meaning ordinary public shareholders effectively fund a company's growth while accepting almost no meaningful say in how it's run. The counter-argument, made just as publicly by the founders who use this structure, is that it protects long-term strategic decision-making from short-term market pressure, precisely the patient capital philosophy covered in an earlier video on this channel, just applied to corporate control rather than investment portfolios. Whether or not one agrees with that argument, the structure itself is a clear, real-world example of this video's central theme: enormous, durable power hiding in plain sight, disclosed in full in a public document that almost nobody outside a securities law firm ever actually reads. 3. The anonymous LLC and the law that tried to end it. The third structural tool in this video concerns something almost every American interacts with peripherally, but rarely understands in detail: the Anonymous Limited Liability Company, or LLC, and the genuinely dramatic ongoing legal fight over whether it should stay anonymous at all. For decades, states like Delaware, Wyoming, and Nevada built entire industries around allowing individuals to form LLCs without publicly disclosing who actually owns or controls them. An LLC could purchase real estate, hold investment accounts, or own a business, and the public record would show only the entity's name, not the specific person or family standing behind it. This is, in effect, the corporate equivalent of a trust's privacy protections, covered in earlier videos on this channel, applied to day-to-day asset ownership rather than a multi-generational estate plan. In 2021, Congress passed the Corporate Transparency Act, specifically to close this gap. The law required most LLCs, corporations, and similar entities formed in or registered to do business in the United States to report their beneficial owners, defined as anyone owning 25% or more of the entity, or anyone exercising substantial control over it, to a Treasury Department bureau called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN. The explicit policy goal, stated directly in the law's own purpose, was to prevent anonymous shell companies from being used to launder money, evade sanctions, or hide the proceeds of financial crime. What happened next is a genuinely live, unfolding story worth understanding in its current form, as of 2026. After the reporting requirements briefly took effect and faced a wave of legal challenges, including a federal district court ruling in March 2025 that found the law's requirements amounted to an unconstitutional search. The Treasury Department, under the current administration, announced in March 2025 that it would not enforce beneficial ownership reporting against U.S. citizens or domestic companies at all. FinCEN then formally revised its own regulations to exempt entities formed in the United States entirely, narrowing the law's practical reach to foreign-formed entities registering to do business in a U.S. state. A Government Accountability Office report released in May 2026 found that this narrowing effectively eliminated more than 99% of the entities that had previously been required to report. Litigation over this entire sequence is still ongoing. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals separately upheld the underlying law's constitutionality in December 2025, even as the Treasury Department's own enforcement posture had already moved in the opposite direction. A genuinely unusual split between what a court says the law permits and what the executive branch has chosen to actually enforce. Meanwhile, individual states have begun filling part of the resulting gap on their own. New York's LLC Transparency Act took effect January 1, 2026, requiring beneficial ownership disclosure for LLCs formed or operating in that state specifically, regardless of the federal government's current enforcement posture, with California reportedly considering similar legislation of its own. This live example illustrates something important about the entire subject of this video. Legal privacy structures aren't fixed, permanent features of the financial system. They're the product of an ongoing, contested policy debate between anti-money laundering advocates who argue transparency prevents serious crime and privacy and small business advocates who argue disclosure requirements impose real compliance burdens without meaningfully stopping sophisticated bad actors who have other ways to obscure ownership. Regardless, as of this recording, in mid-2026, the practical result is that most American LLCs have returned to a level of ownership privacy close to what existed before 2021, a status that could change again with the next final rule, the next court decision, or the next legislative session. If a live, actively unfolding legal story like this is new information for you, that's exactly why this channel exists, to make this world usable knowledge. Subscribe so the rest of this series doesn't get lost in your feed. 4. The private trust company. Keeping control entirely in-house. A fourth structural tool connects directly to the family office exemption covered earlier in this video and offers a specific solution for families who want to keep even more of their financial architecture entirely under family control: the private trust company. We've covered the basic function of trusts extensively on this channel, how they hold assets, manage distributions, and, in the case of dynasty trusts, persist across generations. Normally, a family's trust is managed by an independent corporate trustee, a bank, or dedicated trust company, specifically to ensure a neutral, professionally accountable party is overseeing the assets rather than a family member with an obvious personal stake in the outcome. A private trust company inverts this. Instead of hiring an outside institution, the family creates and licenses its own, dedicated trust company, owned and staffed by the family itself, specifically to serve as trustee for its own family trusts. According to legal guidance on family office structuring, forming a private trust company is explicitly recognized as one path toward qualifying for an exemption from Investment Advisors Act registration entirely, separate from the standard family office rule discussed in Section 1. Attorneys who work in this space note it can be a very useful way of avoiding SEC registration for larger, more complex family structures, provided it's done for genuine governance reasons rather than solely to dodge regulation. The appeal here connects to a theme running through this entire video: It lets a family retain maximum control and privacy over decisions that would otherwise involve an outside institution, with its own reporting obligations, its own compliance department, and its own paper trail. A private trust company is licensed by a specific state. South Dakota, Nevada, and Wyoming are especially popular jurisdictions for this, for reasons connected to the favorable trust laws covered in an earlier video on this channel. But its day-to-day operations, its board, and its decision-making happen entirely within the family's own chosen structure, run by people the family selected and can remove, rather than an outside bank's trust department operating under its own separate institutional incentives. This is, in effect, the corporate governance equivalent of everything else covered in this video. A structure that is completely legal, fully disclosed to the relevant state regulator that licenses it, and yet still manages to keep an enormous amount of financial decision-making entirely outside the view of the general public, journalists, or even most other financial professionals who might otherwise ask questions about how a specific family's assets are actually being managed. 5. The political dimension. Spending without a name attached. The final structural tool in this video moves from finance into politics, and it's important to present this section with real balance because it's used in practice by wealthy individuals and organizations across the entire political spectrum. The 501c4 social welfare organization, colloquially known by the term dark money. Under U.S. tax law, a 501c4 organization is a tax-exempt nonprofit technically organized to promote social welfare. Unlike a traditional political action committee, a 501c4 is generally not required to publicly disclose the identity of its individual donors, provided its primary activity remains social welfare work rather than direct political campaigning, even though it's legally permitted to spend meaningful sums on political advertising and issue advocacy as a secondary activity. This creates a specific, well-documented structural outcome. A wealthy donor can fund political advertising and advocacy at real scale, while the public, and in many cases, even the candidates or causes being supported, never learns the donor's identity at all. Campaign finance researchers across the political spectrum have documented that this structure is used extensively by organizations aligned with both major American political parties, as well as by single-issue advocacy groups spanning environmental policy, business regulation, healthcare, and virtually every other significant area of public policy debate. This is a genuinely bipartisan structural feature of American campaign finance law, not a tool associated with any single political ideology. A point worth stating clearly and directly, since it's easy for this specific subject to get flattened into a partisan talking point, rather than understood as the structural cross-spectrum phenomenon the actual data shows it to be. The underlying mechanism connects to everything else covered in this video. Privacy and disclosure requirements are not simple binary switches that are either on or off across the entire financial and political system. They're a patchwork of specific rules written for specific categories of activity, each with its own history, its own policy rationale, and its own ongoing political debate about whether the current balance between privacy and transparency is calibrated correctly. A donor anonymity rule designed to protect individuals from retaliation for supporting an unpopular cause, the same legal principle rooted in the 1958 NAACP versus Alabama Supreme Court case covered in an earlier video on this channel about anonymous charitable giving, can also, depending entirely on how it's used, obscure exactly who is funding a specific piece of political advocacy from the public that advocacy is ultimately trying to persuade. This is the part of old money and modern wealth that rarely gets explained clearly, the specific, disclosed, entirely legal structures that create genuine privacy without ever breaking a single law. If you want the mechanism-first version of this world every week, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The actual lesson, here's what ties every structure in this video together. None of them are hidden in the way the word secret usually implies. The family office exemption is a published SEC rule. Dual-class share structures are disclosed in mandatory public filings. The Corporate Transparency Act's entire dramatic rollback played out through official Treasury Department announcements, published court opinions, and a Public Government Accountability Office report. Every mechanism in this video is technically available for anyone to read. What actually creates the privacy and concentrated control this video describes isn't secrecy in a legal sense. It's complexity combined with a near-total lack of public attention. A regulatory exemption written in dense legal language, filed away in an SEC release most people will never open, functions almost identically to an actual secret for the overwhelming majority of the public, not because anyone is preventing access to it, but because almost no one outside a narrow circle of specialized attorneys and journalists ever bothers to go looking. Old money, and increasingly new money alongside it, doesn't need to break any law to operate with a level of privacy and control most people will never personally experience. It simply needs to understand and use the same public, documented legal architecture. This entire channel has spent its history explaining one mechanism at a time. If this changed how you think about power, privacy, and what secret actually means in modern finance, subscribe to Old Money Opulence. New investigations into the real mechanics behind generational wealth drop every week. And if you want to see how these same privacy principles show up specifically in charitable giving, watch the companion video. The One Thing Old Money Never Brags About breaks down the legal tools behind anonymous philanthropy in far greater depth. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.